Clint Eastwood walked into the bank, expecting a simple transaction, until the manager sneered, "We don't give loans to people like you." The room went still. Employees glanced at each other, some whispering. But Clint didn't argue. Instead, he smirked, leaned forward, and made one move that shattered the manager's entire career. What happened next exposed corruption, flipped the power dynamic, and left the whole world talking. Stay till the end. This story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The grand marble lobby of Westwood National Bank was a place designed to intimidate. Towering glass walls, gold-plated counters, and sharply dressed executives created an atmosphere that screamed exclusivity. But when Clint Eastwood stepped inside, he didn't look intimidated. He looked unimpressed. Dressed in his signature brown leather jacket, dark jeans, and worn cowboy boots, he was a stark contrast to the tailored suits around him. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. At the center of the room, seated behind an imposing mahogany desk, was Bradley Whitman, the bank's senior manager. Bradley barely looked up. He was a man who thrived on power, a smug executive who measured people's worth by their watch, their shoes, and the number of zeros in their account. And to him, Clint looked like a nobody. Clint approached the desk, resting one weathered hand on the counter. "I'm here about a loan." Bradley finally looked at him, his bored expression quickly shifting into a smirk. "A loan? This old man." "Sir," Bradley said, lacing his fingers together, his voice dripping with condescension, "we cater to a certain caliber of clientele." The young banker standing nearby, a woman in her late 20s dressed in a crisp navy suit, stiffened. Her eyes flicked between Clint and Bradley, recognition dawning in her expression. She leaned down to whisper in Bradley's ear, her voice urgent. "Sir, I think you should." Bradley held up a hand, cutting her off without a glance. "I appreciate your concern, Emily," he said dismissively, "but I can handle an unqualified walk-in." Clint tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. He let the silence stretch, watching as Bradley's smug confidence grew. Bradley leaned forward. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "We're not in the business of charity. If you're looking for a small-time loan, maybe try one of those local credit unions." The lobby was quiet now. A few tellers had paused their work, sensing something was unfolding. Clint exhaled slowly, then reached into his jacket. Not in a hurry, not flustered. Bradley chuckled under his breath. What was this guy doing? Then Clint pulled out a checkbook. But when he flipped it open, Bradley's smirk wavered. This wasn't just a checkbook. It was something else entirely. Bradley Whitman leaned back in his leather office chair, smirking as he watched the old man across from him. Clint Eastwood held his checkbook with an ease that suggested experience, confidence, power. But to Bradley, it was just another hollow attempt from someone who didn't belong. He let out a short chuckle. "Sir," Bradley said, shaking his head as if explaining something to a child, "I don't think you understand." He tapped his manicured fingers on the desk, his polished gold watch glinting under the overhead lights. "We're not a charity." A few nearby bank employees paused their typing. The young banker, Emily, tensed as if she knew this was about to go terribly wrong. Clint remained silent. His piercing blue eyes didn't waver, didn't flinch. He moved deliberately, pulling a single slip of paper from the checkbook, his movements slow, controlled. Then without a word, he picked up a pen, scribbled a number, and slid the paper across the desk. Bradley barely glanced at it. At first, his smirk was still there, still mocking. Then his face changed, his breath hitched, his fingers twitched slightly. His eyes darted back to the paper, as if he had misread it the first time. $50 million. Million. Dollars. In liquid assets. The air around the desk shifted. The few employees who had been eavesdropping suddenly froze. Even the security guard standing near the entrance subtly straightened his posture. Emily's eyes widened. She had already recognized Clint, but now she saw why he was here. Bradley's smirk wavered for just a fraction of a second. But then he did what arrogant men do best. He pretended it didn't matter. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Well," he said, shifting in his chair, "that's certainly unexpected." Clint said nothing. Bradley took a deep breath, then snapped back into character. He straightened his tie, regaining his smug confidence. "You see, Mr. Bradley trailed off, realizing he didn't even know Clint's name. Clint didn't offer it. Bradley exhaled sharply and forced a chuckle. Look, he said, leaning forward, placing his elbows on the desk. I don't care who you are. Your money isn't enough. Emily's jaw tightened. The tension in the bank became suffocating. Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. That's so. The room felt tense, as if everyone had instinctively realized they were standing at the edge of something dangerous. But the only one who didn't sense it was Bradley Whitman. Emily, the young banker standing behind him, looked visibly uneasy. Her fingers tightened around the folder she was holding. She had already tried to warn him, and he had brushed her off. Bradley, however, was too blinded by his own arrogance to notice. With a slow exhale, he crossed his arms over his expensive tailored suit, leaned back in his leather chair, and smirked. All right, he said. Let's say I believe you actually have that kind of money. That doesn't mean you just waltz in here and get whatever you want. He gestured toward the check on his desk, barely acknowledging it now. Money alone doesn't get you in. We do extensive background checks. The way he said it, mocking, dismissive, made the nearby employees glance at each other. They could feel where this was going. Clint, however, remained completely still. His face didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, he lifted his gaze slightly, just enough to take note of the security cameras positioned around the room. There were at least 6 that he could see, all angled downward, capturing everything. The bank's high-ranking staff had begun paying attention. The tellers at the counters were now subtly peeking over their desks. Even the security guard had shifted closer, sensing an unusual energy in the air. Emily took a cautious step forward. Sir, I really think you should. Bradley shut her down with a wave of his hand. I said, I can handle this. His voice was sharp, final. He turned his attention back to Clint, his smirk widening. You think just because you've got a big number on a check, you can walk in here and get whatever you want? He chuckled, shaking his head. It doesn't work that way. We don't just take people's word for it. Emily's jaw tightened. She looked at Clint, almost as if to apologize for Bradley's behavior. Clint tilted his head slightly, considering. Then in a slow, deliberate motion, he placed his hands on the arms of the chair and stood up. The room went dead silent. The way he rose, unhurried, unshaken, made every movement feel dangerous. It wasn't aggression, it was control. The nearby bank employees instinctively froze. Even Bradley's confidence seemed to falter, just for a second. Then Clint exhaled, adjusting the sleeve of his leather jacket. Well, he said, his voice calm but heavy, if that's how you run things. He paused, letting the silence settle like a weight in the room. Maybe I should have a look at the books. Bradley's smirk vanished. The color drained from his face. For the first time since their exchange began, Bradley Whitman felt something unsettling creep into his chest. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was something close. The way Clint Eastwood had stood up so slowly, so deliberately, sent a ripple of tension through the grand marble lobby of Westwood National Bank. The air had changed. The quiet conversations of tellers and bankers had ceased entirely. A stillness settled over the room, one that demanded attention. Bradley, however, was too arrogant to read the moment correctly. He let out a forced, breathy laugh, shaking his head as if amused. And what exactly do you mean by that? He scoffed, leaning forward. You think you can just waltz in here, ask for a loan, and now you want to look at the books? You don't even... He stopped, because Clint had already reached into his jacket. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't aggressive. It was measured. A flicker of instinct made the security guard near the door take half a step forward. But Clint wasn't pulling out a weapon. Instead, he retrieved a folder, a simple, unassuming leather document case. He set it on the desk in front of Bradley with a quiet, almost surgical precision. Then he flipped it open. Inside were official legal documents. At first, Bradley barely glanced at them. He was already rolling his eyes, preparing to dismiss whatever stunt this old man thought he was pulling. But then, he actually read the first few lines. And that's when his expression froze. His cocky smirk stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. His fingers twitched as he gripped the armrests of his chair. The words on the document were unmistakable. Clint Eastwood wasn't here to apply for a loan. He was here because he had just bought controlling shares of the bank. Bradley felt his mouth go dry. Clint finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever. I just bought controlling shares in this bank. The words landed like a hammer. The staff, tellers, bankers, and even the security guards were frozen. Emily, the Young banker clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. Even customers standing near the counter started whispering. The tension in the air had doubled. Bradley's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. This, this wasn't possible. This, this is a joke, Bradley muttered, his voice suddenly hoarse. He glanced up at Clint, expecting some kind of sly grin, some indication that this was a bluff. But Clint wasn't smiling. Bradley's breath hitched. He looked back down at the papers, scanning for something, anything, that could disprove what he was seeing. But before he could finish, the sound of rushed footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The bank's legal advisor hurried into the room, leaned down, and whispered something urgently into Bradley's ear. Bradley's face turned pale. For years, Bradley Whitman had ruled Westwood National Bank like a king. He controlled the loans, the policies, and most importantly, the people. No one questioned him, not his staff, not his clients, and certainly not some old man off the street. But as he sat there, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, he realized something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear. The legal advisor, a sharp-dressed man in a navy blue suit, had just whispered 5 words into Bradley's ear. The documents are completely legitimate. Bradley's face drained of color. His throat tightened as he stared down at the papers Clint had placed before him. No, this can't be happening. Sir, the advisor said in a hushed but urgent tone, Mr. Eastwood now holds controlling shares. He owns more of this bank than you do. The room seemed to tilt for a second. Bradley's fingers twitched, his mind racing to find an escape. He could feel dozens of eyes on him now. The tellers behind the counters had stopped working. The security guards exchanged nervous glances. The clients waiting in line were now leaning in, sensing something was unraveling. And worst of all, Clint was still watching him, unbothered, unshaken, completely in control. Bradley forced out a shaky laugh. He had to act fast before he lost control of the moment. This is ridiculous, he scoffed, leaning back in his chair as if Clint's move meant nothing. You don't just buy a bank overnight. Clint shrugged, his expression casual. You'd be surprised what you can buy when you've got the right kind of money. He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping just enough that only Bradley could hear. And I've got the right kind of money. The words felt like a punch to Bradley's gut. A murmur rippled through the staff. Emily, the young banker who had tried to warn Bradley earlier, was now openly smiling. Bradley's face flushed with anger. All right, fine. You bought some shares. So what? That doesn't mean you get to walk in here and throw your weight around. He let out another forced laugh. What are you even going to do? You don't know the first thing about running a bank. Clint smirked. Maybe, but I know the first thing about cleaning one up. Bradley stiffened. Clint leaned back, stretching slightly. You see, I was going to buy a ranch, spend my days riding horses, maybe sit on a porch somewhere. He gave a mock sigh. But then I thought, nah, figured I'd buy a bank instead. The staff erupted in whispers. Bradley's nails dug into his palms. And then his phone buzzed. A message from the board of directors. Emergency meeting scheduled. Board members only. Without him. For the first time in years, Bradley Whitman felt powerless. His hands trembled under the desk as he read the notification again. An emergency board meeting without him. The weight of what was happening pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. This was slipping out of his control. And then, a voice cut through the tension. I think it's time we talk about what's really been going on here. Emily, the young banker, spoke up. Bradley snapped his head toward her. Excuse me? Emily's nerves were evident in the way she clutched a folder to her chest, but her voice remained steady. She had been waiting for this moment. Sir, you've been approving fraudulent loans for years, she said, glancing around at the staff. Millions of dollars funneled into shell companies owned by your friends. Meanwhile, real customers, small business owners, families, were being denied for no reason other than your greed. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Bradley forced a laugh, though it came out uneven. That's ridiculous, he spat. You think you can just throw accusations around without proof? Emily lifted the folder slightly. I have proof. Silence. The weight of her words hung in the air. Clint, who had been watching with quiet amusement, finally spoke. Well, he muttered, tipping his head. Guess I came just in time. Emily stepped forward, laying the folder on the desk. Every fraudulent loan, every misused account, every denied legitimate application. It's all here, she said, flipping the first page. Open. And before you try to deny it, The security footage backs it up. A wave of whispers and murmurs spread through the staff. The other bankers leaned in, horrified. Bradley's face flushed red. That's complete nonsense, he snapped, slamming a fist on the desk. If you're going to make these kinds of accusations, you better have more than some documents. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she turned toward the security desk. Marcus, she called out, could you roll the footage from last Thursday? A security guard near the back hesitated before nodding. Within seconds, the large overhead screens flickered to life. The entire bank went silent. The footage played, Bradley himself authorizing fake loans under falsified names. Transaction after transaction, time-stamped, undeniable. Bradley's breath caught in his throat. Clint let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that's hard evidence. The staff exchanged shocked glances. Clients watching from the lobby whispered to one another. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A businessman shook his head in disgust. And then, the final nail in Bradley's coffin. A deep, authoritative voice came from the hallway. The shareholders are demanding an immediate investigation. For years, Bradley Whitman had operated with an air of untouchable arrogance. He ran Westwood National Bank as if it were his personal empire, bending rules to his advantage while ensuring no one dared to question him. Employees feared him, board members trusted his polished reports, and clients remained oblivious to the deceit that lurked behind his well-rehearsed smile. But standing in the center of the grand banking hall now, Bradley was beginning to realize that his reign was slipping through his fingers. The once bustling bank had fallen into an eerie silence. Employees had abandoned their tasks, customers clutched their purses and phones, and a cluster of shareholders stood frozen near the glass offices, their faces marked with suspicion. The room felt smaller, suffocating. A team of forensic accountants, dispatched by the Financial Crimes Division, had arrived just minutes ago. Their movements were swift, methodical. Laptops were set up, stacks of paper were examined, and hushed conversations passed between them. Every so often, one of them would shake their head, making quiet notes that only fueled the growing tension in the room. Bradley, standing rigid near his office door, clenched his fists as he tried to suppress the cold sweat forming at his hairline. His once effortless smirk now felt forced, unnatural. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him. One of the lead investigators, a stern-looking woman in a navy suit, stepped forward, holding a thick file in her hands. She adjusted her glasses before locking eyes with Bradley. Mr. Whitman, she began, flipping through the documents. Would you care to explain these off-the-book transactions? It appears that large sums of money have been funneled through unverified accounts under fabricated identities. Bradley let out a short, forced chuckle. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his confidence. Emily, the young banker who had worked under him for years, the same employee he had dismissed as insignificant, spoke without hesitation. Her voice was firm, unwavering. Sir, we have proof that you personally approved over 50 fraudulent loans under fake names. The amounts were too large to be a clerical error. She turned to the forensic team. That's clear evidence of embezzlement. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some customers exchanged glances, stepping back as if being inside the bank itself made them complicit. Employees whispered among themselves, and a few board members exchanged grave expressions, their trust in Bradley visibly crumbling. One of the forensic accountants nodded, placing a printed statement on the desk. And it doesn't stop there, he continued. We've traced direct transfers to offshore accounts connected to shell corporations. Some of those accounts are flagged under international watch lists. That's not just fraud, Mr. Whitman. That's money laundering. Bradley's stomach plummeted. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. His jaw tightened as he tried to hold his composure. This is absurd, he stammered. This is some kind of setup. Who put you up to this? His eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but he found none. Emily, standing tall, folded her arms. No one had to set you up, she said, her tone cool and measured. You did this to yourself. The silence that followed was deafening, and then the rhythmic sound of heavy boots striking the marble floors shattered the tension. The grand entrance doors swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped inside. His uniform bore the insignia of the Los Angeles Police Department, his expression unreadable as he strode toward the banking floor. The air felt heavier. The police chief's voice carried across the room, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. Bradley Whitman, he announced, unfolding a document, an arrest warrant gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For the first time in his career, Bradley Whitman was no longer the one in control. His world, built on deception, manipulation, and unchecked power, was crumbling in real time. The once pristine bank lobby, where he had ruled with an iron fist, now felt like a cage, tightening around him with every second. The police chief's voice still echoed through the hall. "Bradley Whitman, you are under arrest." The room, once filled with murmurs and gasps, froze in eerie silence. Employees clutched their desks, customers stared wide-eyed, and even the security guards hesitated, unsure how their powerful boss would react to being treated like a criminal. Bradley's pulse pounded violently against his skull. His mind raced for a way out, any way out. He couldn't be arrested. Not here. Not in front of everyone. The humiliation, the downfall, it was too much to bear. And then he snapped. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he turned on his heel and bolted for the nearest exit. Gasps erupted. His polished dress shoes skidded against the marble floor as he pushed past stunned employees. Desperation contorted his face as he knocked over a chair, sending it clattering into the ground. A few gasps turned into murmurs. Was he really running? "Sir, stop!" one of the security guards yelled, but Bradley didn't listen. His breath came in ragged, panicked bursts as he sprinted toward the revolving doors, his sweaty fingers reaching for the glass. He could already imagine the headlines if he escaped. Banking tycoon flees, unjust accusations. He could spin the narrative, hire the best lawyers, blame someone else. He just had to get out first. But the moment he reached the exit, he slammed into a wall of muscle. Security had anticipated his move. Two uniformed guards, both towering over him, blocked the doors like immovable statues. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a firm grip, stepped forward. "Not happening, Whitman." Bradley stumbled backward, his chest heaving. His perfectly tailored suit, always pristine, now had creases of desperation. His eyes darted wildly, searching for another way out. Then he exploded. "You can't do this to me!" he bellowed, his voice shaking with rage. "I built this place. I am this bank." His hands curled into trembling fists. "You think you can just take everything from me?" Clint Eastwood, who had remained calm through the entire ordeal, finally spoke. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Then, in his signature, low and gravelly voice, he delivered the final blow. "And now," Clint said, his gaze locking onto Bradley's crumbling expression, "you're going to watch it fall." The chilling sound of handcuffs clicking shut around Bradley's wrists echoed through the silent bank lobby. The flashing lights of cameras were blinding. The moment Bradley Whitman was let out of the bank in handcuffs, the world erupted. Reporters swarmed the entrance, like vultures circling a dying animal. The once dignified bank, a symbol of wealth and exclusivity, now stood as the epicenter of scandal. "Mr. Whitman, did you really steal from your own clients? Is it true you laundered money for wealthy elites? Any comment on the fraud allegations?" The questions flew at machine gun speed. But Bradley, his face red with humiliation, kept his head down. His expensive suit was now wrinkled, his once smug demeanor completely shattered. The flashing camera lights bounced off the sweat on his forehead as he desperately avoided eye contact. Clint Eastwood, however, stood just inside the glass doors of the bank, watching in silence. His presence was imposing, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't. He didn't need to say a word. The truth was already speaking for itself. Within minutes, news channels broke the story. Breaking news: bank CEO arrested for fraud, inside a scandal worth millions. The footage of Bradley's humiliating downfall played on repeat, broadcasted across every major network. Social media exploded. The hashtag #Whitman exposed trended worldwide, with users dissecting every detail of the scandal. "This guy denied my small business loan last year. Turns out he was giving fake ones to his rich buddies." Karma came quick for Bradley Whitman. Couldn't have happened to a better guy. Clint Eastwood buying part of the bank just to expose corruption? Legend. As the chaos unfolded, the bank's board of directors scrambled to regain control. Inside the executive conference room, the atmosphere was suffocating. The members sat around an expensive mahogany table, whispering in hushed, panicked voices. "The shareholders are furious," one director muttered. "The public's lost all trust in us," another admitted, rubbing his temples. The chairman, a gray-haired man with decades of experience, exhaled sharply. "We have no choice," he said. "We must cut all ties with Bradley Whitman immediately." There was a beat of silence. Then a vote was cast. Moments later, a press conference was announced. The board's decision: Bradley Whitman was officially stripped of his position as CEO. The boardroom was silent. The polished oak table, where power had once been dictated by wealth and deception, now felt like a battleground where Clint Eastwood stood as the last man standing. Across from him, the board of directors sat stiffly, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes desperate. The chairman, a man who had spent decades navigating corporate politics, finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, choosing his words carefully, "given the circumstances, the board has decided to offer you full control of Westwood National Bank." The weight of his statement settled over the room. Even the air felt heavier. Clint leaned back in his chair, unfazed. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, now lukewarm, but his expression remained unreadable. "So let me get this straight," Clint finally said, tapping a finger against the armrest. "You're asking me to run this bank?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but the chairman kept a straight face. "Yes, sir. You've already proven yourself as a man of integrity, and frankly," he hesitated, then continued, "we need someone the public trusts." Clint's gaze swept over the room. These were the same men who had let Bradley Whitman operate unchecked, who had turned a blind eye to corruption as long as the money flowed. Now they were looking for a savior. A muscle twitched in Clint's jaw. "Let me tell you something, fellas," he said, setting his coffee down with a quiet clink. The room tensed. "I never wanted a damn bank. Never cared much for suits, titles, or board meetings." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "I didn't do this to take over. I did this to clean up the trash." A murmur spread through the room. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman adjusted his tie. Then, "What do you propose to do with your controlling shares?" Clint exhaled through his nose, glancing down at the stack of documents that legally made him the most powerful man in the bank. Then, without hesitation, he reached for a pen. One signature. And just like that, he relinquished every single share. The board gasped. Even the young banker who had exposed Bradley's corruption covered her mouth in shock. Clint stood up, rolling his shoulders as if he'd just shrugged off a burden. "I'll be donating my shares to the Small Business Development Fund." Silence. You're giving them away?" one director sputtered. Clint adjusted his jacket. "A bank should be about building people up, not tearing them down. Let's see if you boys can get that right this time." The chairman sat frozen. The bank's fate was now in the hands of the people Clint had just empowered, and no one saw it coming. The boardroom remained eerily silent, as if the very walls were trying to process what had just happened. Clint Eastwood had just signed away millions of dollars in power, as if it meant nothing. But to him, it really didn't. Clint leaned back, arms crossed, watching the stunned expressions around the table. The chairman, still gripping the papers Clint had just signed, finally found his voice. He hesitated, swallowing. "You're just giving the shares away?" Clint gave a slow nod. "That's right. Every last one. No man should own a bank just because he can. It ought to be run by people who actually give a damn." The room remained frozen. Then a voice broke through the tension. "What about her?" All heads turned toward the young banker, Sarah Lawson, the woman who had risked everything to expose Bradley Whitman's corruption, the one who had refused to stay silent, even when it could have cost her career. A few of the board members exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves. One of them cleared his throat. "You mean, put her in charge?" Clint nodded. "That's exactly what I mean." Sarah's eyes widened. She had spent years watching men like Bradley hoard power and abuse their authority. And now, in the space of a single afternoon, everything had changed. The chairman adjusted his glasses, still struggling to keep up. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood, she's young. She's never run a bank before." Clint's jaw tightened. "Neither did the crook you let run it before her, and she actually knows what she's doing." A pause, then, to Sarah's own shock, the board members started nodding. One of the senior directors sighed. "It's time for a change." Another added, "She's been the one trying to fix things this whole time." Within moments, it was unanimous. Sarah Lawson was officially appointed as the new head of Westwood National Bank. Clint turned to her, and for the first time since he walked into the bank that morning, he smiled. "You got a good head on your shoulders, kid. Don't let 'em change that." Sarah swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she accepted the position. "I won't, I promise." Under her leadership, The bank underwent a complete transformation. Policies were rewritten to ensure fair treatment for every customer, small businesses were given priority, and corruption was no longer tolerated. Clint didn't stay for the celebrations. That wasn't his style. Instead, he walked toward the exit, unbothered, unrushed. As he reached the doors, he tipped his hat back, glancing at the gold-lettered sign above the bank's entrance. With one last smirk, Clint muttered, "Now that's how you run a damn bank." And then, just like that, he was gone. Bradley Whitman sat on the cold metal bench of his jail cell, his hands clenched into fists, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and disheveled. The flickering television mounted on the wall in front of him was his last connection to the world he once controlled. The news anchor's voice echoed through the small, dimly lit cell. And in a stunning turn of events, former Westwood National Bank executive Bradley Whitman has been arrested on multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and corruption. Sources say that Whitman had been funneling bank funds into fake loans for his associates while denying loans to small businesses and working-class clients. His downfall came at the hands of none other than Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood, who, in an unexpected power move, exposed the scheme and forced an immediate investigation. Bradley gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening as the screen cut to Clint standing outside the bank, surrounded by reporters. The camera zoomed in on his calm, composed face, the desert sun wrinkles on his skin making him look even more intimidating. A journalist raised a microphone. "Mr. Eastwood, why did you go through all this trouble? What made you decide to bring Bradley Whitman down?" Clint took a moment, adjusting his signature cowboy hat before answering in his usual slow, gravelly voice. "Simple. Crooks like him don't deserve to run anything." Bradley let out a shaky breath, his stomach twisting into knots. The screen changed again, this time displaying a massive banner unfurling outside Westwood National Bank. The bank's new slogan, printed in bold capital letters, read, "Honesty over greed." The image was everywhere, on social media, news sites, even trending worldwide. Bradley's face twisted in rage. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be untouchable. The cell door rattled, breaking him from his trance. A guard stood outside, smirking. "Looks like you're famous now, Whitman. Too bad it ain't for the reasons you wanted." The other inmates started murmuring, some chuckling, others shaking their heads in disgust. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, leaned against the bars of his own cell. "You're that banker, huh? The one who thought he was too big to fall?" He let out a low whistle. "Guess you were wrong." Bradley felt the walls closing in. Everything he had built, every ounce of power he once held, it was all gone. As the news played on, the last thing Bradley saw before the screen faded to black was Clint Eastwood walking away from the bank, unbothered, his legacy cemented, while Bradley's was left in ruins.